In this video, we will talk about Chapter 17, the Digestive System. And I'll go ahead and I'll warn you now, this chapter is one of the more involved, one of the more complex chapters in the course. We deal with a lot of hormones, a lot of enzymes, with really long, complex, cumbersome names. So it's very, very important that you keep up the material, especially for this chapter. Alright, first we'll start with the formal definitions for digestion. This is both the mechanical and the chemical breakdown of food into smaller forms that your body can absorb. So not only is it breaking down chemically, but turning the food into smaller pieces mechanically. The system will consist of what's called the alimentary canal. It's a long tubular passage that goes from the mouth all the way down to the anus, plus all the accessory organs that help empty into that. Alright, here's an image of both. The alimentary canal, mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. And all of that is one continuous, open, long tube. From everything from your mouth all the way down is one continuous space. And some of the accessory organs that we'll talk about, the salivary glands, the liver, gall bladder, and the pancreas. It's kind of hard to tell in this image, but this kind of gives you a breakdown of the length of the alimentary canal from the tongue down to the pancreas is about half a meter. It's about maybe 1.5 feet. The length of the small intestine here is about 6 meters. That's roughly about 20 feet. And the length of the large intestine is about 1.5 meters, which is about 6 feet. So there's an awful lot of space kind of crammed into your body, and this very large surface area is needed to absorb more nutrients. Alright, first we'll start with the structure of the alimentary canal, and it has basically the same structure throughout the entire length, both from the esophagus through the intestines all the way down through the anus. And there are 4 basic layers: the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscular layer, and the serosa. The first one, the mucosa, this actually will protect the tissues beneath it by secreting a layer of mucus. This is also where materials get absorbed in that mucosa layer. Just below that, you have the submucosa. This is where you'll find the blood vessels that help nourish the surrounding tissues. Next, we have the muscular layer. This is what will provide the movement of materials throughout the canal through a process called peristalsis. This is a wave-like contraction, moving forward the mass of food that you just swallowed. And I'll show you a picture of this here in a second. And the outermost layer is the serosa. Alright, if you were to zoom in on a piece of the alimentary canal, see here, and we'll see this image again here in a second. Mucosa layer here, where everything gets absorbed. Just below that, submucosa, where you find the blood vessels. Just below that, the muscular layer. There's 2 different types of muscle here, but we'll talk about it in general, the muscular layer. And just below that, the serosa. Here's what I was talking about earlier with the peristalsis. Whenever you swallow a mass of food, now it's called a bolus. So the muscles behind it will contract and moving this forward. So it's a continuous wave-like motion. That's what's called peristalsis. That's how food gets from your mouth down to the esophagus, through the stomach, and move through the entire length of both the small and large intestines. And then when you are vomiting, that's reverse peristalsis, where this that should be going forward is now going backwards out through the mouth. We'll talk about each individual component, working our way down. We'll start with the mouth. This is where digestion actually begins, with the mechanical breakdown. Taking the piece of pizza that you just ate, turning it into smaller bits of pizza. And also adding to that the saliva. And whenever you add saliva to food particles, that's called mastication. And of course the tongue, the muscular organ that helps move food toward the pharynx as you swallow. Alright, salivary glands, as you would imagine, they secrete saliva, which helps to moisten the food, which makes it easier to swallow. and will begin the chemical breakdown of the food that you just ate. Within the saliva, you'll find various things. One is mucus to help lubricate the food for swallowing, and also an enzyme called salivary amylase. This will help break down the complex sugars or the starches in your food. There are 3 different types of salivary glands, and they vary in size and location. The largest ones are the parotid glands. These are just in front, just anterior to the ears. You have these submandibular glands. These are found on the floor of the mouth, on the lower jaw. Remember, the mandible is your lower jaw, so submandibular glands. And the smallest of these 3 are the sublingual. These are found on the floor of the mouth, just below the tongue. Sub means below. Lingual is a reference to the tongue, so just below the tongue. Here's an image of someone looking to their upper left, and here's the tongue kind of pointed up that way, kind of lifted up on the roof of the mouth. The parotid glands are here. They're just anterior to the ears. Sublingual, they're just below the tongue, right here. And then on the floor of the mouth, or floor of the jaw, submandibular glands. All those are salivary glands. Alright, next we'll move on to the teeth. The teeth are the hardest structures in the entire body. And even though they are really, really strong, really hard, they're not considered to be a bone or part of the skeletal system at all, because they have a totally different structure compared to bones. So the teeth are part of the digestive system, not skeletal. In your life, you will have 2 sets of teeth. Your baby teeth, or primary teeth, or also called deciduous teeth. You'll have about 20 of those. Then as you get older, you'll lose those. Then you'll get your adult teeth, or also called your permanent or secondary teeth, and you'll have 32 of those. Next, we'll move on to the pharynx and esophagus. The pharynx is the cavity just behind the mouth, which will where you find the esophagus leading down to the stomach. Basically, the pharynx is another term for your throat. Neither the pharynx nor the esophagus actually digest food. They just serve as a way to help move food down to the next stop in the station. So the next stop here would be the from esophagus down to the stomach. And the esophagus is a very straight, collapsible tube that will help propel food from the pharynx onto the stomach. Alright, the esophagus will join the stomach at a circular muscle called the cardiac sphincter. And this sphincter is what will kind of seal off the stomach to keep stuff that's in the stomach from leaking out. So whenever you have heartburn, the very acidic stomach acid is getting past this cardiac sphincter and leaking back into the esophagus, and that's why it burns so bad. And here's how this looks. The esophagus would extend from way up here, and it meets the stomach right about here. So this should close and seal all the way. So all the gastric juice and stomach acids don't leak back out and actually burn the lower part of the esophagus. That's why it's called heartburn. We'll talk more about the stomach and the parts of the small intestine here in a few minutes. The stomach is a J-shaped pouch-like looking organ. It's about 30 centimeters long, and it has 4 main functions: to receive food from the esophagus. It will mix food with what's called gastric juice. We'll talk about what exactly this is here in a second. Initiates the breakdown and digestion of proteins, and then once all that's done, we'll move food to the small intestine. There are some general parts of the stomach. The first one, the cardia, is a small area just near the esophageal opening. Right next to that, what's called the fundus, which is a temporary storage area, just superior to that cardia area. The main portion of the stomach is called the body, where you get that J shape that most people recognize. And then the last part of the stomach is called the pylorus. This will lead to the opening of the small intestine. Within the stomach, you'll find things called gastric folds, or also called rugae. These are creases in the lining of the stomach that help it allow it to expand. So they basically are just wrinkles or creases within the stomach, and it helps it get larger as you ingest more food. And then the pyloric sphincter. This is a muscle that will control the emptying of the stomach contents into the small intestine. This has to be regulated pretty strictly. We'll talk about the hormone that takes care of that here in a few minutes also. All right, some more detailed image of the stomach. Now the lower esophageal sphincter here, or cardiac sphincter here. Cardia right near here. Just on top of that, the fundus. The main portion is the body. The pylorus right here. Pyloric sphincter here. And these creases, these wrinkles, are the rugae. This is what allows the stomach to get larger as it fills with the contents. Alright, the gastric secretions. There are going to be 3 types of secretory cells found within the inner lining of the stomach, called the gastric glands. And all 3 produce something different. And here's where we get into the material that people will get lost on or get confused the most on. All the secretory cells, all the secretions, that leads you to all the hormones and all the enzymes. So from here on is where the material gets more difficult. Alright, first we'll talk about the 3 types of secretory cells. The first one, the mucus cells, as the name implies, they secrete mucus. It's what will provide a very thick protective layer on the inner lining of the stomach, which is what you need, because the stomach is very, very acidic, and this mucus isn't produced in large enough volumes that stomach acid will eat away at the inner lining of the stomach. That's what an ulcer is in the stomach, where this isn't produced as much, or it's being eaten away by a certain bacteria. Next type of cell, parietal cells. These are the cells that actually make the hydrochloric acid found in the stomach, which is why it's so harsh of an environment, so acidic due to the hydrochloric acid. And parietals also secrete what's called intrinsic factor, which helps the small intestine help absorb vitamin B12. And the third are the chief cells. These will secrete an enzyme that's inactive when it's first secreted. It's called pepsinogen. This gets activated when it's mixed with hydrochloric acid. Once that happens, you get the active form called pepsin. And this is the most important gastric enzyme, pepsin. It's also where we get the name for the soft drink Pepsi. The soft drink was developed here in North Carolina, down at the beach at New Bern. It was developed to help cure upset stomachs. So this being the most important enzyme, the creator just dropped the N, so instead of pepsin, you get Pepsi. Okay. When you add all of these secretions, the mucus from the mucus cells, hydrochloric acid from the parietal cells, the pepsin from the chief cells, all of that together is collectively known as the gastric juice. Alright, here's an illustration of a close-up look of the inner lining of the stomach. The layers we talked about before, mucosa, submucosa, muscle layers, and the serosa. And you'll see how the various secretory cells are kind of arranged. It's kind of hard to tell which is which by looking at this. Alright, the gastric secretions must be regulated fairly tightly, because you don't want one to get secreted too much or too little. Somatostatin, which we talked about before with the pancreas, this will inhibit acid secretion. You don't want the pH to get too low, so somatostatin will kind of make sure that doesn't happen. Gastrin, this will increase acid secretion. You don't want the pH to be too high either. So these two kind of work in balance with one another, helping to keep the pH fairly low but not too low. Next one, CCK, or cholecystokinin. This is released by cells of the small intestine when proteins and fat enter the small intestine. And the whole goal here is to decrease gastric motility. And here's what that means. All the material that's in the stomach can't be allowed to empty into the small intestine all at once. There'd be way too much stuff there to handle. So what CCK does is to limit what can enter at a certain amount of time. And the analogy I always like to use here is, think of a bouncer at a club. Someone who has that velvet rope in their hand. They let these 5 people in, then they put the rope back down, and you have to wait 30 minutes. Alright, or you 4 can go in, or you have to wait. Or you 5 go in, you other people in line have to wait. So this is what will control how much stuff is allowed in from the stomach into the small intestine. Right. Although the gastric enzymes they'll begin to break down proteins, the stomach is not really well adapted to absorb any kind of digestive products. It's way too acidic. It's way too harsh of an environment. All right. And once the food that you eat is exposed to all these gastric juices and turned around and jumbled and mixed, your food is now turned into a semi-fluid paste called chyme. And from here, the chyme will enter the small intestine. And unfortunately, everyone in the class, most likely everyone in general, has seen what chyme looks like. If you've ever had diarrhea, that's what chyme is. It's not exactly the lunch that you just had. It's not exactly feces yet. It's that semi-fluid paste. So whenever you have diarrhea, you are actually seeing chyme. All right, next we'll move on to the pancreas. Like we talked about with the chapter on the endocrine system, the pancreas has a dual function, both endocrine and exocrine. Where we talked about the endocrine portions, now we'll talk about the exocrine functions of the organ. And the exocrine function is to produce a digestive juice called the pancreatic juice. Now this pancreatic juice is made in very specialized cells that form small clusters called acini. Now these clusters will secrete or release their secretions into small tubes that will merge into larger and larger tubes. And this will give rise to the pancreatic duct. And this pancreatic duct will run the entire length of the pancreas. This will empty its contents out into the small intestine. Okay, and here's how this looks. There's the stomach, the first part, small intestine. Just behind the stomach is the pancreas. Here's kind of this first portion is kind of cut away so you can kind of see inside. These smaller circles here are the endocrine portions, the islets, Langerhans that we talked about before. And these are the exocrine portions. The acini or the acinar cells will secrete or release their secretions in here. And all of this is the hepatic duct here. They all merge together like off-ramps onto a major highway. Then they all dump out into the small intestine. Now the pancreatic juice will contain enzymes that help digest the carbohydrates and fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. And here are some that you'll find in that pancreatic juice. Pancreatic amylase. This will break down glycogen into disaccharides or smaller sugars. And pancreatic lipase will help break down the triglycerides, the fats. Now all of the words on here are all interrelated. First you have enzyme that's found in pancreatic juice called trypsin. This is released as the inactive form called trypsinogen. When this is mixed with an enzyme called enterokinase, then it gets turned on. Then it gets activated into the active form called trypsin. This, along with chymotrypsin and carboxypeptidase, all three have exactly the same function. They all digest and break down proteins. And the key here on this whole slide is this, enterokinase. This activates trypsinogen into trypsin. Trypsin activates these two. So if enterokinase isn't there, trypsin doesn't get turned on, which means that these two don't get turned on. So enterokinase is, on this slide anyway, the more important term to focus on, because this starts everything else from turning on. Also in pancreatic juice you have nucleases, which helps to digest nucleic acids. And the key thing about pancreatic juice is its ability to be very high in pH. When you think of the contents coming out of the stomach, they're going to be at a very, very low pH, around between 1 and 2. You can't have something that acidic, that strong, going into the small intestine, because it would just tear it all to hell, because it's way too strong. So you have to neutralize that. So the only way to neutralize something that's very low in pH is to add something that's very high in pH to it. And that's what the pancreatic juice is. It has a very high concentration of bicarbonate ions. And the whole effect here is to raise the pH, so the small intestine can tolerate the contents. So this bicarbonate ion is a buffer to help neutralize the strong acidic environment of the acid from the stomach. So this pH here is around, I want to say 10 or 11, so that will help neutralize it into a much more tolerable pH that the intestines can handle without being damaged. All right, now we're going to the hormones that will help regulate the secretions of the pancreas. The first one, secretin. This will help the pancreas to release the pancreatic juice, high in bicarbonate ion, or bicarb, as a lot of people want to call it. Cholecystokinin, CCK, we talked about before. This will help the pancreas to release the pancreatic juice that's high in digestive enzymes. Alright, here's an image that puts all that together. You have acidic chyme entering the first part of the small intestine, duodenum. The mucosa lining of the small intestine will release secretin into the blood. That secretin will stimulate the pancreas to release the bicarbonate ion, which will help lower that acidic chyme. Alright, next we'll move on to the liver. The liver is your largest internal organ. The largest organ in general is your skin, but the largest organ internally is the liver. It's divided into two lobes, the right and left. And it contains a very unusual circulation system called the portal system. And what happens here is the portal vein will carry blood in the veins before it goes back to the heart. So after the blood is absorbed and used by the tissues in the intestines, instead of going directly back to the heart, like every other part of your blood does, blood coming from the intestines goes to the liver to be filtered again, and then it goes back to the heart. That's called the portal system. Here's a generic image of the liver. You have the two lobes here, Gall Bladder underneath. This is looking at it from the underneath side. Alright, here's a diagram of the hepatic portal system. You have the small intestine absorbing when it needs to from the blood. The nutrients will travel into the hepatic portal vein. They go to the liver first to get filtered again. And then after it gets filtered in the liver for the second time, then it goes back to the inferior vena cava, and then it goes back to the heart like normal. This is only found in the blood from the intestines into the liver. Now, the functions of the liver, it'd be really difficult to list every function of the liver, so here are just the key ones I want to focus on. It will produce glycogen from glucose. Remember, glycogen is the stored form of glucose. And it will help break down that glycogen back into glucose when needed. It will help to synthesize plasma proteins, such as the clotting factors. It will help destroy worn out and old red blood cells and any kind of foreign substance. And of course, it will help remove toxins from the blood, such as alcohol and drugs. Bile. Bile is the greenish, yellowish liquid that the liver makes constantly. Most people associate bile with the gallbladder, but it's just stored in the gallbladder. The liver actually makes the bile. And within the bile, you'll find water and bile pigments and bile salts and cholesterol. And if this is made in excess, you'll get the yellowish tint to someone's skin and eyes. That's what's called jaundice. And this means that your liver is starting to fail. So jaundice is usually a good indicator that something is pretty seriously wrong. Alright, the function of bile. This helps to break down fats into a form where your body can absorb them and actually use them. And by doing that, that process is called emulsification. It's turning lipids or fats into small droplets. So that's what emulsification is. And when that happens, it's much easier for the body to absorb that material. The gallbladder, like we mentioned before, is where the bile is stored until it's needed. Even though the liver makes it, it's just kind of put away like in a garage, like the gallbladder is, until it's actually told to secrete it. And it's only going to be secreted into the small intestine when stimulated by CCK, cholecystokinin. Here's another diagram of all that together. You have the chyme with fat entering the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. The mucosa layer of the small intestine will release CCK into the blood. That CCK will stimulate the gallbladder to secrete the bile, and that bile will help take care of that fat in the chyme. All right, next we'll move on to the small intestine. This is where most of the work for the digestive system gets done. This is where all the materials get absorbed. So this is the structure or the organ that does all the heavy lifting for this system. It's a long tubular organ that goes from the pyloric sphincter that hooks up with the stomach and connects to the large intestine. This will complete the digestion of chyme. It will absorb all the products it needs, and whatever is left will be moved on to the large intestine. And there are three parts to the small intestine: the duodenum or duodenum, jejunum, and the ileum. That's the correct order. Duodenum's first, then jejunum, and lastly the ileum. Okay, here's the stomach. The first part, duodenum, jejunum, and then the last part would be the ileum. Alright, there are very tiny projections on the mucous membrane called intestinal villi, which give the small intestine a large, very large amount of surface area. The larger the surface area, the more material they can absorb and more quickly. And each of these villus, or each of these villi, have within it a core of blood vessels and a lymphatic capillary called a lacteal. And on the surfaces of these villi are even smaller fibers called microvilli, so increasing that surface area even more. Here's an illustration of how this one looks. You have arteries here, arterioles, you have veins here. The green are the lacteals, or the lymphatic capillaries. And this is one finger-like projection, one villus. This is how one actually looks if you're looking at it in cross-section. All these are villi, and these tall or the small projections on top of that are the microvilli. So this is one small section of the small intestine. There are enzymes associated with the microvilli. The first one, peptidase. This will break down peptides into amino acids. These next three are all linked together: sucrase, maltase, and lactase. These are all enzymes that break down disaccharides into monosaccharides. So a sugar with 2 units into a sugar with just 1 unit. And then lipase will help break down fats into its 2 constituent parts, the fatty acids and the glycerol. Of course, hopefully you'll remember from either chemistry or from intro biology, any term that ends with the suffix ase, like lactase, is an enzyme, and it tells you what it's breaking down. So lactase will break down the sugar lactose. Maltase will break down maltose. Sucrase breaks down sucrose. So anything that ends in OSE, ose, is a sugar. Anything that ends in ASE is an enzyme. And you're told what it breaks down. Alright, next we'll move on to the large intestine. It's called large not because it's longer than the small intestine, it's because it's wider. It's actually much shorter than the small intestine, but the diameter is actually a little bit larger. The first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. This is where you'll find the appendix attached. Then you'll have the different parts of the colon. Whenever you see the word colon, that's always a reference to the large intestine only. You have the ascending colon, which is where material are moving upward. You have the transverse colon, where you're going from right to left. Then you have the descending colon, which is going down. And then the sigmoid colon, which is the S-shaped portion. From there you'll have the rectum, which is the last portion of the digestive tube. The anal canal, which is the last 3 to 4 centimeters of the colon. And then, of course, the anus, the opening to the external environment. And here are all those put together. The first part, the cecum, appendix still attached here. Material move upward. Ascending means to go up. So ascending colon. Then the material will go from here directly over here. Transverse colon. Then it will go down. Descending colon. This S shape here. Sigmoid colon. The rectum, where feces will be kept until it's ready to be pushed out. Anal canal, and then anus. Alright, functions of the large intestine has very little to almost no digestive function. Its big thing is to absorb water and electrolytes. If it absorbs too much water, you're going to be constipated. If it absorbs too little water, you're going to have diarrhea. So neither one of those are something that you want. So it's important that the large intestine works properly. Here's where you also find the naturally occurring bacteria in your intestine, the natural intestinal flora. And of course, the other main function of the LI is to form feces and to carry out defecation. And of course, we can't talk about this chapter without talking about feces, so we'll talk about it briefly. Feces is made of materials that weren't absorbed or weren't able to be digested. That includes things like water, electrolytes, mucus, bacteria. And the color of the feces is really determined by how the bacteria in your intestines interact with the bile pigments. And you can actually tell a lot of someone's health by the color and shape and overall texture and density of someone's feces. So that's why this test is, a stool sample is a good diagnostic tool. Even though it is kind of gross, it is very helpful. Alright, the next two slides are the last two slides in this chapter, but they're probably the most important. We've covered a lot of hormones, a lot of enzymes, and these two tables, 17.8 and 17.9, are taken directly from the book, and they list everything that we have talked about in this lecture. So all the hormones are listed here, all the enzymes are listed here. Know what their name is, where they come from, and what they do. So for those of you that like to make flashcards, note cards, all the information that you need is on these two slides right here. So if you are comfortable and familiar with even half this information on these two slides, then this chapter gets a hell of a lot easier for you. So again, if you have questions on this material, please contact me either in lab or out of lab, and feel free to post on the discussion board.